Ohio people with Mennonite views, and they're gonna give us some missional news. Ohio Conference Cast.
You are listening to Ohio Conference Cast, a podcast dedicated to sharing missional stories and other information about Ohio Mennonite Conference.
Welcome to Ohio Conference Cast. Today I am one of your hosts. I'm Paula Snyder Belousek, the assistant moderator of Ohio Conference and the pastor at Salem Mennonite in Elida. And my co-host today is, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I am Jacob Dodson, pastor at Worcester Mennonite Church.
And we are really excited. We have two illustrious guests with us today that we are excited to introduce to you. We have Dan Miller, our new interim conference minister, and Larry Rohrer, our new regional pastor for the east side of the state. And so we are really pleased to have both Larry and Dan with us today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Well, Larry and Dan, we have sort of been introducing you lots of different places, but we wanted to give an opportunity for our constituents, the wider community of Ohio Conference, to hear from you. And so just for a chance for people to get to know you a little bit, tell us a little bit about your background and what led you this point in your lives. So Dan, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Okay. One of the things I think that brought me to this is that I was born into a pastor's family. So I have been intimately acquainted with both the bright side and the dark side of the church since I was carried into the church as a baby. And I have become pretty strongly convinced of the power of the church to be an agent of healing, which is the light side, which is the one I hope for and the one I like to nurture. But and then there's the dark side too. We are incredibly capable of injury and harm to one another. I did about 16 years of transitional ministry in 9 different congregations. Really enjoyed that. I don't know if I might talk a little bit later about how God kind of tricked me into that, because I was really going to be a pastoral counselor. That was my thing. But I did the transitional work. And then I worked with Indiana-Michigan Conference as a conference minister for over 12 years. Recently finished up an interim time at Zion Mennonite Church in Archbold. And I was having so much fun being back in congregational work. I figured that I would do that until I dried up and blew away in the wind when this invitation to come to Ohio Conference came up. And I didn't think I would say yes because I was having so much fun in the congregation. But as I prayed about it, sat with it, took counsel from some people, I really became convinced that this was the direction to go. So I have that sense of like leading in this. And I also know that it's not an easy time to work in church and church organizations. So I carry both that sense of anticipation and also knowing that there is challenge.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Larry, what about you? Tell us a little bit about you and what led you to this place.
Well, I grew up in a blue-collar home, a family of truck drivers and construction workers and such, and a family that for which the church was let's just say the family life centered around the church. They were very closely connected, one to the other. I heard a call to ministry very early in life. When I was 7 years old, I was quite ill, landed in the hospital, to make a long story short. And as I was in the hospital, I was in isolation, very much alone. And my pastor came every day to visit with me, to be with me, put on the garb, all that needed to be done to enter into isolation. And that had such an impact on this 7-year-old child that I said I wanted to be a minister just like A.J. Neuenschwander. And truth be told, I didn't mind dreaming about his 57 Chevy either. But that was a call that continued to grow. God wouldn't let go of that call. And that led to Eastern Mennonite Seminary and eventually 40 years of ministry in 3 congregations, both in Ohio and then in Indiana, after which I retired and we moved back to Dover, Ohio, to care for my wife's father. So for 3 years, we were caring for her father, all during the period of COVID and the pandemic, and when we were once again isolating ourselves from everyone else so that we could care for him. So I went from pastoring a congregation of a couple hundred to a congregation of 1. And that was quite a challenge in itself. But he passed about a year ago, and it was at that point that I began to ask the question, God, do you have a place for me somewhere, to use the gifts that I've been given? It's interesting that was answered, first of all, in an interim pastorate this past summer, when my pastor was on sabbatical, so I was able to step in for him. As a result of that, then the next step came the invitation to be considered for the regional pastor in Northeast Ohio and Northwest Pennsylvania. We do have congregations in Northwest Pennsylvania as well. And so here I am, and I feel empowered. I feel energized to serve after several years of being out. It's been something of an affirmation that God can still use me.
It's really interesting to see and to hear how both of you came to these positions from such different circumstances and situations. And I kind of wanted to ask a little bit about, as you considered entering and serving in the conference, could you unpack a little bit more what drew you to come, and then also what might excite you about being in the conference? Maybe we could start with Dan, because Dan, since you had shared first and expressed a little bit of reticence about that decision because you were enjoying so much about congregational life, how did that shift take place? And then as you really started to pursue it more and the door opened, was there some form of excitement or expectation that grew in you as you did feel like affirmed in accepting it?
Well, one of the things that I thought about was there aren't a lot of people who can just step into an interim conference minister role, like that have some experience and kind of know what the job is like and can just come in and start. So I thought, well, I can do that part of it. I like Ohio Conference's vision statement. I like the idea of leaning into these dual commandments of loving God and loving neighbor, and then also of making disciples. I think in this time of the church, there's a great reality that we cannot control what is going to happen. We cannot control decisions that other people make. The only decision we get to make is, what kind of people are we going to be on the other side? Are we going to be people who love God and who love our neighbors? Are we going to be bitter people who withdraw and hope for another ark that will destroy the world while it saves us? And I believe really strongly in the whole idea of spiritual practices that form us and shape us in the character and the spirit of Jesus. I relate with that. And then this whole idea of discipleship too. A church planter consultant once said that all living things reproduce. Well, except for those those of us who have infertility problems. A healthy living thing, the expectation is reproduction. And so churches will give birth to churches, but individuals are the ones who make new believers, not by going out and having a crusade and beating people over the head, but by living like Jesus, loving like Jesus, being firm like Jesus, and inviting others to come and follow us as we imperfectly follow Jesus. It takes a lot of work to wrap all of those three things into a vision statement. And Ohio Conference did that. And I really like that. I think that has a lot of power and a lot of potential for the future of the conference and who Ohio Conference can be and become.
Thank you, Dan, for sharing that. That's really helpful. And how about you, Larry, as you think about your story? What was your initial feeling as this door opened for you to enter this position, and what are your emotions surrounding it as you come in? Do you have some excitement or expectations for it?
Yeah. I think what drew me to this position was the phone call from Paula. That was the initial.
Larry, don't say that too loud because people won't want to take phone calls from me.
You caught me in a weak moment, Paul. And I thank you. I thank you because as I was looking at the mission statement of the Ohio Conference, it reminded me of a seminar that I had been to a number of years ago, led by Dr. Leonard Sweet. And Dr. Sweet had made the comment that he couldn't understand why congregations spent so much energy trying to draw up a mission statement. And then by the time they drew it up, they were so exhausted they didn't do anything with it. His comment was, we already have been given the greatest statement in the scriptures itself. We have the Great Commandment and we have the Great Commission. And lo and behold, I look at our conference mission statement, and we have the Great Commandment, and we have the Great Commission, in which all of us as congregations can be on the same page, regardless of other issues that may divide us or whatever. Those two words are the words that draw us together as God's people, with the desire to be faithful in living out the calling that we've been given as the Ohio Conference. That's what has brought me to the threshold here and crossing that threshold and being a part of this grand experiment that we call the Ohio Conference.
Well, and I'm so grateful that both of you said yes, and it really has felt like the movement of God's Spirit, that both of you were available and willing to say yes at a time where we needed people to help come move us into this next stage as we're moving through our reorganization process. So I'm grateful to God. I'm grateful that Larry did pick up the phone. And I remember feeling like, I don't think he's going to say yes to this. And so when you did come back and say, yes, I'm ready to go, I was like, okay, Jesus, you are full of surprises. And so really grateful that both of you are willing to say yes to that stirring of the Spirit.
Yeah, you talked, Paula, about the current process that's happening. Because I was at Zion for 18 months, I was at ACA and some of the cluster meetings beforehand for March 2023. And I've been through a lot of processes, and some of them are impressive and some of them are not. But I just was so impressed with the work that was done at ACA. I told Jeannie afterwards, I think that's one of the best group processes that I've been a part of, that I've witnessed. It just felt like Jeannie has done such a good job, was doing such a good job and has continued to, but at that point was doing such a good job of listening and helping people listen to each other, and then using those comments to create something, as opposed to coming in with a cookie cutter approach or some kind of predetermined outcome that she was going to make happen by pushing everybody's input into her categories. And I just haven't felt like she did that. And that also gave me great hope about coming into the process as it has been happening, and trusting that will continue to move the conference in a good direction.
And of course, you're referring to Jeannie Zimmerly Yancey, our process.
Yes.
Just for those who may not know. Yeah. Yes, she has been a real blessing and a gift to us as we've moved through this process. So that kind of moves us to maybe what do you see are some of the biggest challenges as we continue through our restructuring process and prepare ourselves for the next? Larry, do you want to say anything about kind of the challenges that you sort of see in the work that you've been given?
I think one of the biggest challenges for me stems from the job description that I've been given, and that is to work with the pastor peer groups. We have one pastor peer group that is focused primarily in the Wayne and Holmes counties, and it's geographically close enough that such pastors can come together in person. We have another pastor peer group that is so scattered all throughout Northeast Ohio and Northwest Pennsylvania. And it's much more difficult to bring them together as one. And so we have tried the Zoom process that has had probably less rather than more success. I consider that a challenge because these pastors care very deeply about their congregations and their desire to be faithful in leading their congregations. How are they being supported? How are they being resourced? And so in fact, I just sent a note out to those pastors yesterday saying, I'm going to come to you. I want you to know that you are not alone, but a part of this this picture of the Ohio Conference, in which we are not some organization with satellites around, but we are sisters and brothers in Christ, and we desire to bring that oneness as sisters and brothers together, at least in spirit, if not always in person. But that's my idea, to just go and to listen and to support and just to be one-on-one with these pastors that we care about very deeply.
Wonderful. How about you, Dan? What are some of the challenges that you are ready to dig into?
You make it just sound so glorious the way you asked that question. One of the challenges is personal in that when I worked with Indiana Michigan Conference, I had been a part of that conference for years, and I understood a lot of things from the inside out. I come to Ohio Conference, and I'm aware that it's very dangerous to assume that I can just take all of those cultural understandings of Indiana, Michigan, and project it onto Ohio Conference and then respond in exactly those ways. And so trying to consciously ask questions about things, try to understand as much as possible how Ohio Conference operates, how relationships operate, different things before jumping in with an idea or a solution, or hey, would be a great thing for Ohio Conference to try. I think that's really important. I mean, I always think listening is important, because we can have so many assumptions. There are two, like what I consider to be worldwide phenomenon that are happening right now that make it really difficult to be in the church. One is we are in a time of increasing tribalism, whereas we are inclined to hang out with people who are like us and to see everybody who is not like us as an outsider and an enemy. And regardless of your political persuasion or your economics, this is just happening everywhere across the world, whether you're Christian or Muslim or anything. I mean, it's just happening. And that creates local realities for all of us. Like, what does it mean to follow Jesus with these people that I absolutely don't agree with? Can I do that? Or do I need to separate? Do we need to separate? And I think different people make different responses to that question on the ground. And it's one of the sadnesses for me when people choose to leave. That it's hard to lean into that sadness and just accept that's going to be true. But it's a reality. It's just a reality. Another thing that I think is worldwide is we are being failed by a lot of the systems that we as human beings put into place. The church has failed us. Banking is failing us. Politics are failing us. At least we all feel in some ways like we're being failed by those institutions. And so this is not a great time to talk about, hey, don't you want to be a part of this church institution? And we're going to do a great job for you. We're going to do things together that we can't do by ourselves because we're going to do it all right. And now I cannot think of this Lutheran pastor's name. Woman.
The Nadia Bolz-Weber.
Yes. She tells people when they come to her church, we're glad to have you here. If you stay around long enough, we're going to offend you, and you're going to offend us. And the question is whether we can stick together long enough to work through that or not. And so I think in this time of disillusionment in our institutions, there is something about, again, building from the ground up, having local congregations who build character and invite people to follow Jesus and to open to the transforming work of the Spirit, and then to humbly work together with other local groups and develop relationships, because we're not meant to be alone. But it is a challenge because there just are lots of reasons to be mistrustful of motives and motivations. So those are the challenges that I think of as I have come into Ohio Conference.
Before we started recording today, we had presented a few options for questions for you both, and one of them focuses on your hopes for the conference in the coming years. And just as you were finishing there, I was going to follow up with that question, but I think you've just sort of articulated those hopes. And if I can, I want to mirror them back and then have you respond to see if I'm hearing you correctly. You're saying that part of your hope for our conference is that we can be countercultural, working against some of these trends that we're seeing of tribalism and the sense of loss of any hope related to our institutions. And instead we can be bridge builders, and as a conference do better at connecting across our differences. And am I hearing you correct in what you're saying there? And would you respond to and go a little bit beyond that? Are there more things that you would add as you think of hopes for our conference?
Yeah, I like that, the way that you said that. You use different words than I was using, but those words capture it. I think bridge builders, having hope. I am not sure how much I like against language at this point in my life and ministry. I mean, not that we always agree, or I don't want to be namby-pamby about it, but one of the things that I observe so many times is that as we define ourselves against, if we're going to be against hatred, if we're going to be against anything, patriarchy, if we're going to be against racism, there is a thing in us that begins to rise up and be arrogant, that begins to say, we are the right ones. And I'm very hesitant about cultivating that kind of a thing in us, either personally or organizationally. But yes, in the face of disappointment, hope. In the face of disappointment and disillusionment, to trust, to seek to be trustworthy people, to seek to be people who follow the Spirit, even though, there are people sometimes who follow the Spirit and do the stupidest things that we would never want to own, but to still trust that the Spirit of God is moving among us and that the Spirit can guide us, resource us, empower us in the face of all these challenges that we're working with. Yeah. So to not give up, to not become the jaded, bitter people that nobody wants to be around. We might be right, we might be right and be jaded, and nobody's going to want to be with us. Whereas I don't think that's the way Jesus was. It's the craziest thing, right? Jesus was righteous. Jesus was right. And all these people who did terrible things loved to be around him. How did that happen? I mean, to me, that is just that is just one of the most exciting things about Jesus, is that he didn't sacrifice his integrity, but somehow people wanted to be around him. That might be one picture of what I would hope for a Ohio conference. Not that everything is right, not that everybody performs, but that somehow Ohio conference is attractive. People somehow are drawn to this thing that happens when they're around people who are part of Ohio conference congregation.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really rich. And I'm kind of wondering, Larry, when you heard Dan talking there, does that have any connections with your own experience, or how would you articulate your hopes for the conference? And maybe even as you answer that question, maybe that could also flow into how could you envision collaborating with Dan also as you work together in conference towards these hopes?
Dan said it so well. I'm not sure that I can even add to the comments that Dan has made, quite frankly. I'm also thinking that what we can do, and I would want to include Tony in this conversation as well, that if we talk about the congregations of the conference collaborating, it seems to me then that the leadership of the conference is a model for what the congregations can also live into. And that includes close communication between myself and Dan and Tony Dorman being the Western regional pastor. I think there is so much that we can do to show the rest of those who make up Ohio Conference what it means to be one in Christ. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we must be in agreement or full agreement, but that we can live as those who are drawing others into ourselves, just as Jesus was drawing the crowds unto himself. And I think that I think we can live into that. You know, the scripture passage for the upcoming annual assembly is, I believe it's Philippians 2, verses 5 to 11 and such. And I'm struck by the way that passage moves, and that we are supposed to be of the same mind as Christ, and to be humble as Christ. And then he goes on to describe how Jesus emptied himself of his glory in order to be human in that sense, but giving that example. And it seemed to me that if Jesus is our example for that emptying of himself, then should we not live in a manner that lives after the manner of Jesus? It lives after the manner of Christ. It's very much the same idea as taking up our cross and following him.
Thank you. That's a good call for us as we think about what our mission is as we move forward together. And that helps to also help us to think ahead to the annual conference assembly as we look forward being that. And that's a great way for us to gather unity together as we come together as a diverse people. Jacob, we've been having like lots of really serious conversation. And I know that Dan and Larry are also guys who really laugh a lot. So I was wondering maybe if you would just tell us maybe 2 or 3 kinds of things about you that you enjoy or you do when you're not talking deep theological stuff. So how do you spend your time? So Larry, what do you get up to when you're not doing Ohio conference work?
I have a number of interests. In fact, I probably have too many interests. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint. Some of you know that I do have a love for music of all kinds. I do play the piano when someone needs a pianist on the spur of the moment, and that often is what takes place, which I am glad to do. I'm always happy to step in for others who have need. Other times when I'm just seeking perhaps a way of reprieve is just getting on my bicycle, riding. Our family, my wife and I have always enjoyed gardening, and we do quite a bit of gardening, except when the deer eat everything from our garden. And that's when I have to confess that I am not so much a pacifist when it comes to those deer. But those are some of the interests that we have. Reading, of course, I love to read as well, some things like that.
Yeah. Who knew that gardening could be so good for the prayer life, right? You've got to repent of, violence against
That's
fear, right? How about you, Dan? What kinds of things do you like to get up to?
Well, I should confess up front that I really am a fairly serious kind of person, and I love to have these kind of conversations and reflections. One of the things that is really relaxing for me is reading, not theological reading and that kind of stuff, but like I love science fiction. I love things that help us to imagine a different reality, and take us to a different place. There's something about reading that puts the world right, even though nothing in the world changes. I just find that is really helpful to me. During the pandemic, well, and slightly before, just before the pandemic, my wife and I went to Germany and we visited her brother and his wife. And over there, you walk a lot. And so I was really challenged to walk. And I found that during the pandemic and since then, walking has been like a nourishment for my soul. Somehow, when I walk, I don't know, the world just gets better. And my frustration or my fears or whatever decrease. There must be something about the way our bodies are made that walking and doing things in the physical world make a difference for us. I do like to laugh. I think it's really important that we party. In most congregations, I have said at one time or another that we need to look for reasons to party, because sometimes we forget. And so we just need to do something fun, have people around, create reasons to smile and enjoy one another.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for sharing. And I wanted to ask if there's anything else that any of you would like to say before we close our time on the podcast today.
Okay, this is the serious side of Dan again. Larry talked about Tony, and he reminded me, like, there are some wonderful people here in Ohio Conference. I have enjoyed really getting to know the other staff that are part of Ohio Conference and the leadership team. We had an in-person, face-to-face meeting of the leadership team recently. It was my first meeting with them. And there was this tender spot inside of me that as these people sat around the table and conferred with each other and shared different opinions and wrestled together about the things that they were talking about, like these people really care, and they are high quality people, and they bring good thinking and prayerful thought to this stuff. And I mean, I know it's true, right? There are good people everywhere, and yet it's just really fun to experience that. And I have enjoyed that as I've come into Ohio Conference.
I consider it a privilege to serve. And in this particular case, Dan was talking about the others involved in leadership and getting to know others who are involved in leadership and just knowing how much they care about the church as well. It feels good to me to be a part of that unit and to continue to grow. I myself am being challenged to grow because of the good people that God has placed around me.
That's a good word, Larry.
How about for you, Paula? Is there anything you might like to say before we close our time?
Just that I'm grateful for Larry and Dan and their willingness to say yes. I'm grateful for all of our staff at Ohio Conference. We are really blessed. And so I just encourage those who are listening to keep praying for our staff and for our leaders as we move through this year of reorganization and wait for the Spirit to birth what is going to be new. I'm just really grateful for all of the people that make up this community that is Ohio Conference. So keep praying with us and for us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our listeners today who have spent time hearing the stories and the thoughts that were shared. And I also want to thank our sound engineer, Norm Sohar, and the voice of our podcast intro and closing, Megan Sohar. We pray for God's richest blessings on all of you. Thank you again for this time. Goodbye.
Ohio people with Mennonite views, and they're gonna give us some missional news. Ohio Conference Cast.
Thank you for listening to another edition of Ohio Conference Cast. We would love to hear from you. Our email is ohioconferencecast@gmail.com. Ohio Conference Cast is brought to you by the Ohio Conference Leadership Team, along with Norm Sohar, sound engineer, Megan Sohar, voiceover, Ann Lehman, publisher, and our many guests and listeners.